the one being, whose entire existence feeds off the energy of the Elder Gods. Eventually, the Elder Gods don't want to be his food anymore, so they wage war against the one
Meanwhile,
being.
the reformed Cyberlink Quay attacks the Special Forces base and kidnaps both Pash Johnny and Sonya. After this happens, Raiden takes the rest of the
Shao
heroes.
Kahn, who resurrected Sindel and started to merge the Earth and Outworld together anyway. This kicked off the Battle of Earthrealm as the Mortal Kombat warriors faced down Shao Kahn's forces and Liu Kang had to defeat him yet again. The Outworld fighters were sent packing.
The Mortal Kombat series is a trip. This series is one that has 6 realms, multiple instances of time travel, 2 timeline resets, a fusion, zombies, and like 80 different Sub-Zeros. Which one is Dom Zero? I tried, okay? Sometimes I don't. So I want to ask a question. Why is this series so fucking wacko? And also, why is it that it's gotten so much crazier over time? So today I want to look into fighting game stories, the theories for how they're crafted, and why Mortal Kombat and others are so insane. I also want to discuss where I think the movie series is going to go based on all of this. Wait. Not that movie series. I mean this movie series. Although that movie series is amazing in itself.
Your brother's soul is mine.
Mortal Kombat released in 1992 and was originally conceived by 2 dudes as just a game starring Jean-Claude Van Damme. That was it. The original Mortal Kombat is super simple. It's a fighting tournament for the sake of our world, and that's pretty much it. But for fighting games around that time, that's just how they were, and that's because fighting games as a genre are pretty unique. So I want to first lay the foundation for why that is, so that I can explain why stories like Mortal Kombat end up the way that they do. Fighting games were an arcade co-op experience and genre, not some storytelling device. Major plot-focused storytelling didn't really appear until home consoles became more common. Look at other fighting game series and you'll get the same deal. Both Street Fighter and Tekken were relatively similar when it comes to their stories, either because of their focus on fighting tournaments or more simple character-focused plots. An exception to this is Tekken 1 though. When it was ported to PlayStation in 1995, we actually got FMVs. I mean, just look at this one featuring Kazuya and Heihachi, his dad, where Kazuya throws his dad off a cliff. Besides that being the greatest thing I've ever seen, it shows that when ported to consoles, fighting games were starting to use console sensibilities within their story creations. As I stated before, Tekken, Mortal Kombat, and Street Fighter were, first and foremost, just fighting games. The stories are either non-existent or afterthoughts, which makes sense for the arcade experience. Not only do the booths take money to play, but the atmosphere of an arcade just lends itself to fun with friends and not watching numerous cutscenes to understand deep characters or a complex plot. And while these arcade sensibilities are long since gone in the United States, they're still very alive in Japan. The game that proves that this is a thing is Final Fantasy Dissidia NT. Upon its release in 2015, NT was placed in arcades in Japan and didn't have a story mode. When it was released to consoles, the game added a section, essentially just dedicated to cutscenes and story. I mean, a bad story, but it was there. What this reveals is that the fighting game genre, as a result of its arcade roots, is crafted without really any real story focus. Dissidia NT shows that, even to this day, the arcade genre doesn't suit itself well for storytelling. And I'm going to argue that when this story focus is introduced, you get some really interesting results. The first Mortal Kombat game that actually was entirely developed for a console was Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, which is just Mortal Kombat 5. And this is the game that starts to really get into some crazy shit. Mortal Kombat had been on consoles prior, but all the previous titles were made with arcade in mind first and foremost, and the ports to consoles essentially just added the story. This meant that the stories of those titles essentially had to be warped to conform to the characters and areas that were already included in the arcade modes. Now, this isn't to say that there was no story included in the arcade versions. That's the point of arcade mode, but it is to say that the arcade games didn't have dedicated story modes that focused on anything other than a particular character. Also, arcade mode endings in most fighting games are always non-canonical anyway, unless you want to say that Johnny Cage, Kano, Liu Kang, Raiden, Scorpion, Sonya Blade, and Sub-Zero all won the tournament, and that's obviously not true. We all know that it was Chan Kang.
Your brother's soul is mine.
Mortal Kombat 5, in order to be a game suitable for consoles, added some extra modes, like Conquest Mode, where a story was more front and center. Conquest Mode reveals what we were hypothesizing earlier. The shift to the consoles meant that more content needed to be added, especially more single-player content. And you can add single-player content that doesn't focus on a story, but it's clear that this doesn't necessarily suit games from a marketing standpoint. If you want people to care about the characters within your fighting games, and you want them to choose them for their punches and kicks, you want them to grow a connection to them. Easiest way to do that is to just craft a story that focuses on them. Also, Deadly Alliance added a crypt, where it was kind of like a gacha system. Oh my god, what did I get? Lou! What'd you think about that? Me doing it twice. Pretty funny, right? Well, you're gonna see it again. You're gonna see it one more time later in this video, so you better be prepared. The next few games are the ones that start introducing some complex and wild-ass elements, like every main character dying and Raiden sending back a message to his past self to stop these events from happening. And this is where Mortal Kombat 9 begins, and is essentially a soft reboot of the series. It's one of the timeline resets that I spoke of in the beginning. We're reintroduced to the characters and the setting, and we kind of get a Spark Notes version of some of the games. I think they needed to do this, not only because the original games were old and the story was becoming too much, but also because of the nature of fighting games in general. Fighting game stories are unique to other games, not only due to their arcade origins like we've spoken about, but also because of the nature of their gameplay. Action games, RPGs, shooters, and horror series all have leeway with regards to their gameplay mechanics. There's really a lot that can be done in those spaces because those genres are so broad. Just look at RPGs, for example. RPGs have strategy RPGs, or action RPG hybrids, or turn-based RPGs, etc. What makes something an RPG is specific, but not so specific that they determine the way in which you play, just certain components of that play. But fighting games, due to their arcade roots, have a very strict gameplay formula. This formula has changed a bit, such as changing from a 2D arena to a 3D arena, like certain games have done, but it doesn't change the fact that you need at least 2 fighters on the screen for a match of player skill. So then why does this matter? Well, just look to how stories are crafted in general. The story for games need to be crafted to fit the genre that they're in. Here's an example. You can't have a survival horror game have your main character be a god that's untouchable. That would defeat the point of survival horror and shift the genre of the game entirely. Thus, the gameplay would need to be shifted as a result. Ultimately, there's a symbiotic relationship with storytelling and gaming. The gameplay and stories need to fit one another so that one doesn't contradict the other. So with fighting games, you can't have a modern fighting game that takes place with a really small cast of characters, because if you did that, your roster of fighters would be smaller, and as a result, the actual gameplay would suffer. But we need to go even further than that. It's not just the rosters. I mean, your characters need to do the most obvious thing, which is fight. This is obvious, but if you think about it from a story perspective, it starts to make sense why games like Tekken, Street Fighter, and Mortal Kombat are so fucking weird as their series become older and older. Just think about it. If I told you to write a story where, like, every 5 minutes, 2 characters have to fight each other, and that those 2 characters needed to be from, like, max 37 characters, unless you're Smash Bros, in which case you have 37 sword characters, you're gonna have to do some weird shit. Either A, you're gonna have to make people fight over the smallest of things. You ate my Sammy, Scorpino.
Takes 2 to tango, Dom Zero.
See if you can fight when you're starving.
Scoochie on over here.
Or B, you have to start coming up with reasons why characters switch sides from protagonist to antagonist, or bringing characters back from the past to fight future versions, or having zombie palette swaps. Like, it all just starts to click why most fighting games rarely focus on their stories. And for the ones that do, like Mortal Kombat, why those have such convoluted stories and character moments. Also, because these characters are consistently fighting, you've got to have some deaths. But I mean, you also can't really have those deaths stick, since those characters are the backbone for your games moving forward. So how does this all relate to the new film releasing? Well, buckle up, because it kinda doesn't. But hold on, it doesn't because this medium isn't like the games. I honestly don't think that the Mortal Kombat movie or likely future films will really delve into the craziest of Mortal Kombat stories. Things like the timeline resets or time travel. I don't think we'll ever really see these realized into film, and that's because those things don't have to happen anymore. The game series almost had to go through these events to work from a storytelling perspective because of the constraints that fighting games have to have in their stories, like we just spoke about. As we've looked at, fighting games started within the arcade, and their genre requirements as a result really mean that our stories need to fit certain molds. Films instead don't have these restrictions. Like, yes, the film adaptation is an adaptation of that source material, and as such needs to take characters and inspiration, but it can also craft a more well-rounded, character-centered story that doesn't rely on wild plot points. Like, the movie has to have fights, but not to the degree that the games did, and the movies can also just make the fights make more sense than the games did, too. Scorpino, did you eat my Sammy?
I did. But I actually got you another one.
Scorpino, I don't know what to say.
Just say what you've always wanted to say. Just say.
Look at you. Thinking I was gonna do it again. I lied. I wasn't gonna do it again. Ultimately, we'll just have to see how the film develops to truly see where they might go, but if I had to guess now, it will be nowhere near as insane as the games. From their arcade roots to their transfer to home consoles, fighting game DNA just means that if the story is focused on, we're always in for a trip. And isn't that ultimately a lot of the reason why a lot of us love Mortal Kombat?